Hi, so you made it back with your footage from downtown. By now you have a pretty good collection. And I'd like you to be able to work with some footage that you shot in either 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second. What you're doing is you're going to slow your footage down so that it looks smoother in a 24 frame per second sequence. This is the sequence. And this is 24 frames per second. Now, when we say 24 frames per second, officially it's 23.98 frames per second. And when we say 30 frames per second, it's 29.97 frames per second. And when we say 60, it's actually 59.94. So you've got to have those numbers to be able to do this work. So here's my first clip. And it's just one of those flowers going, and it's 23.98 frames per second. Okay? Now I have another clip here, and I'm just going to right click and go to my properties. And you can see that it was shot at 30 frames per second, or 29.97. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the edge off, it's called, and I'm going to slow this piece down just from 30 frames per second to 24. So here's how I do it. I right click or control command click. I right click on a Mac and go to modify and go to interpret footage. So I want to assume this frame rate. Now the file is 29.97. But I want it to act like it is 23.98. All right. Now it may make it a little longer, and we'll see in a second. So here's my clip. I'm going to say OK. And you'll see it went from 8 seconds to 10. Now I'm going to put this clip in, and I'm going to just trim it a little bit so you can see where I start to spin it. And let's trim that up a little bit, get that right there, trim this up here. And you're not going to see much of a difference, okay? Because I was spinning them at different speeds too. But that is 29 frames per second, slowed down to 24 frames per second. Now let's do one more. I think this one I shot at 60 frames per second. And let's just see if I did. I did indeed, 59.94. So let's see what this looks like. And 60 frames per second. There we go. So I'm going to slow this down. Now this one you may see a little more of a difference. So I right clicked, I went to modify, interpret footage, assume this frame rate, and I'm going to be 23.98. All right, now my clip was 24 seconds. I slowed it down, it's now 25. So now when I put a piece of this in, it's going to be slowed down. So let's just go ahead and drag this in. And here it goes. Now, this is a little different, right? Because I actually spun this. Here we go. Okay, here's the piece where I spun it. So I'm just going to trim that up a bit. Let's get to where my hand leaves the frame right there. And I'm going to use my razor tool. I'll click that right there. Come back to my pointer tool. I'll delete this. Remember, I can use the / key to see everything. I'll just drag that in. And now you'll see, here's a clip at 23.98. Here's a clip at 30, slowed down. And here's a clip at 60, slowed way, way, way down to 24. Now, you don't see a big difference in the 30 to 24, but that's because, you know, this flower was on a tripod and I was moving it by hand. But if you did indeed take your camera off the tripod when we were downtown and you changed the frame rate to 30, and you changed your shutter speed to match at 60, then you would see less camera shake and less movement. when you do this. And if you really got some slow motion, maybe you gathered a bunch of leaves, or maybe your friend or your partner jumped off something and you shot it at 60 frames per second and you slowed it down using this method to 23.98, then you would see that person kind of slowly gliding through the air or something like that. One of the key things, though, is to know what clips are doing what. If you have a bunch of clips of a tree and you just changed one, you really got to know what that is. My big recommendation is before you get going on a project, you take the time to just click these names and you rename them so that you know just what is going on. And then when you're working on things, you can keep track of things much easier. Otherwise, you have a bunch of clips and you don't know what they are. So the process one last time is you find a clip that has been shot at a higher frame rate than you're using. Just go to Properties and check it. Yes, indeed, that's 30 frames per second. I'm working with 24 today. Right-click, go to Modify, go to Interpret Footage, go to Assume this frame rate, and enter the frame rate that you want to end up with. And for me today, it was 23.98. Say OK, and now you have a slow piece of footage, or slightly slower. Okay, I hope that's helpful. As always, ask questions.